I see. Not to beat the horse dead, but let's kind of go into like some practical application. If I mean, of course, we're not going to get like super detail heavy, but let's just talk about things that like everybody accepts as necessarily you can't do this as far as policy is concerned, but actually might not be a bad idea. I wrote down a few of them that just came to the top of my mind, but let's just start with one like price controls or wage controls. Like, can you just talk about a little bit about the pros and cons of that and what it actually means in like a non-biased way?
Well, that's something which I have a lot of background because in the immediate wake of Pearl Harbor in early 1942, the United States went to a system of price control under something called the General Maximum Price Regulation. And this was administered by an agency, the Office of Price Administration, of which my father, John Kenneth Galbraith, was the director for prices. So I grew up in, let's just say, a household which had a unique experience with the problem of wartime price control. And price control at that time was essential because without it, you would have had it would have been very difficult to manage the enormous expansion of production that was going on and of incomes that was happening in the United States economy as people were hired for war mobilization without having a runaway inflation, excess demand for all kinds of goods. And so what price controls did during the war was to keep a lid on all of that and enable people to be assured that if they put their money into government bonds, they wouldn't lose purchasing power. And that helped both stabilize the economy during the war and created a basis of financial wealth in the household sector that fueled much of the early post-war expansion. So extremely valuable and successful experience. It's much harder to have a permanent structure of price control in a peacetime environment and in a world in which there's a proliferation of different types of products, and everything is a little different from everything else. But there are some prices which are clearly still administered. The interest rate being one of them. The Federal Reserve is the agency that sets the cost of funds to the banking sector, and there was a lot of mythology about that. But what actually happens is that the Federal Open Market Committee meets every 6 weeks and decides what that interest rate is going to be. And there are other prices. The wage structure, for example, in the federal service, which is a substantial body of employment, is set by fiat. The minimum wage is set by law. And those key prices, the price of oil is another one, which is at least in part and substantially controlled by a cartel, or at least by the key member of that cartel, which is Saudi Arabia. And these prices then are taken as the basis for the cost structure in the economy. Destabilizing them is always a risky thing to do because it tends to ripple through the entire structure of costs and make life for private business very much more difficult than it would otherwise be. So we tend to believe that prices are all set by the market, but key prices, in fact, are not set by the market. They're set by social institutions and everything with that kind of thing.
Oh, Professor, I kind of lost you right there. Could you repeat that last part?
I was just saying that we tend to believe that prices are set by the market, but key prices are not set by the market. They're set by social institutions that we, in fact, do have control over.
So the belief that we actually should let the market, that first off, the false belief that all prices are set by the market and that's just the way things are, and that any attempt to change that would create some sort of distortion kind of flies in the face of reality, right? Like, I think that because we believe that, I really do feel like the policy discussion can't move forward in ways that really will be beneficial to us, because there are some things, we're just talking about prices and wages right now, but there are some things that can be achieved, just like you said, right after what you said, 1942, we had price control and wage controls during that time to kind of prevent, I think you were saying demand pull inflation, right?
Well, during the Second World War, we had comprehensive price control. And we had them again during the Korean War, and we had them again briefly for a year or so in the early 1970s under Richard Nixon. So this is not something which is alien to the history of the United States. There's a specific experience of it.
But I believe that's maybe, for a reason, right? There, just like economics is a social construct, there are forces that would want to use it to basically push certain policies regardless of their effects, and will either co-opt or use anything it can to make sure that that's moved forward. Just like you were saying, it'll demonize certain things regardless of what they actually accomplish or what they did, what they can or cannot do. The downsides will seem huge, and the upswings or the upsides will seem very, very small. Because I really do believe that things like controlling the market or having like a planned economy might be something we can move towards, but that's almost blasphemous in like public discourse today.
Well, as a matter of fact, there is, of course, a good deal of planning that goes on. It goes on at the level of cities. It goes on at the level of transportation networks. It is what the United States Congress is there to do, is to make legislative decisions which require thinking about what the future is. So there's a reasonable provision for the future is what we have a government to attempt to provide, and to pretend that all those decisions can be taken by a decentralized market is a formula for self-delusion, of course. But let's just talk about one narrow aspect of this, which is a problem that I work on a great deal, is the question of inequality, and particularly inequality in the structures of pay. One aspect of that is a minimum wage, and whether the minimum wage should be raised by a lot, let's say, as the current proposal and now the Democratic platform urges, from $7.25 to $15 an hour. That would have a significant effect on the structure of wages. It would give a raise to maybe 35-40% of the American workforce, depending on how close they are to that minimum now, of greater or lesser extent. But it would create a wholly new structure of wages with a substantially higher bottom end. Now, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? That's a debate that the economics profession has been having for a long time. Some people say, well, with that cost of labor, people would lose their jobs, and it's probable that some would. But the other side of the story is twofold. One is that it would greatly increase the purchasing power in families with low-income earners, and those people would have more income, they would spend more, and so new jobs would be created to meet that demand. And the other thing, which is a longer-term effect, is that when you have a wage structure like that, you tend to encourage businesses to advance their investment in productivity enhancing activities, and that raises overall productivity and living standards. So you have a couple of effects which work toward improving living standards and improving purchasing power against an effect which works on the cost of labor. And it's the experience of countries that have pursued that policy that the positive effects tend to predominate, that they tend to do pretty well out of that, which is why I think moving to a $15 minimum wage would be a very good thing. Now that's a judgment I would make as an overall student of political economy, but it's one about a social decision, if you like, a planning decision that needs to be taken by the public, by in effect, since the minimum wage is set by the government, and it needs to be taken by the United States Congress.